Hey everybody, Alan Ward here from Strictly Guitar, and in today's video I'm going to show you how to use your POD HD500X as a MIDI controller. And today's actually the first of two videos. So today I'm going to talk to you about how you set up the HD500X to send MIDI messages, and in the next video I will show you how I use it within Bias FX2, which is a program I use. It sits on my computer, so it's an amp modeler simulator. Think of it pretty much like whatever the pod can do, Bias FX does. The difference is the pod sits in a floor unit, Bias FX sits on your computer, and it's essentially a plugin. I use my pod a lot when I'm playing out. So I play in a church, we use in-ear monitors. The pod is fantastic. Between the pod and my Variax guitar here, I can pretty much pull off any sound that I need to in that environment, and it is so super convenient to walk in essentially with a guitar and an effects unit, and that's it. Setting up and packing down is so easy. What I find is when I'm at home, I don't use the pod as much. I tend to plug my guitar straight into my sound card, into the computer. I use Ableton Live for recording, and so I've been getting into amp sims, and Bias FX2 is the one that I use most. So a few weeks back I was sitting thinking, I know this can be done. I would like to use my pod simply as a MIDI controller to control turning effects on and off within Bias FX2. How do I do it? So in this video I will show you how to set that up. The pod controller in its MIDI function is quite powerful. So the other thing I've been using it for, and worked out last night, is within Ableton Live, some of the functions in there as well. So for instance, if I'm looping in Ableton Live to start recording a loop and to stop recording a loop, if I'm playing, it's very hard to press a button or do a mouse click or use my launchpad controller to do that while you're playing. But with a foot switch, as you know, things are really simple. You just keep playing, you get to the end of the loop, you click the switch with your foot, and it's recorded that take and it's looping again. So it's quite powerful. I do have the Behringer FCB 1010 MIDI controller. I have had that for years, and I will get around to using that as well as simply a MIDI controller for Bias FX. The reason that I've used the HD500X initially is simply because it's usually out sitting on the ground in my music room here. So I don't have heaps of floor space, so if I could use it for two purposes, one as a MIDI controller and the other is when I feel like it to actually play through it, then it's a good thing. So that's why I'm using the HD500X. I've got the HD500X edit program up, and I just want to show you here on the front page, essentially the effects, there's nothing. So I've got a patch that I just call MIDI Control Change 1, and it is completely clear. There's no effects, there's no amps in it. I've done nothing more with it. It is simply a nothing tone. So you plug your guitar in at one end. In this case, my Variax. It goes into my into my pod, goes out of my pod into my sound card. There's no coloration of the sound. It's what I think is pretty much, you know, pure bypass. Where the fun happens is here in the controllers section. You would probably be familiar with the top section here, controllers and foot switch. This is where typically when you're using the HD500X, you would assign the pedals to turn off the delays, turn on and off the reverbs, the distortions, the modulation, all that sort of stuff. And where you would assign, say, the expression pedals to a wah. So think of the same concept, but we're going to the level down here, physically on the page to this bit that says Midi Assign. And this is where you will assign the different foot switches on the pod different MIDI values, and I'll explain what that means. So the first one here is foot switch 1. Foot switch 1 on the pod, if you've got one, you have a look at it. It's the second from the left on the top. There's two rows of pedals. The very left row or very left column of pedals is your bank up and down. They can't be assigned. But your next pedal over, your foot switch 1, is the first one showing on here. So I'll just explain the values and what's important and what's not. I've got it set up to MIDI channel 2. The default, if I scroll down here, is this value of bass. My understanding is that bass is just like the default value, so it's like almost like an all channels kind of thing. A real basic understanding of MIDI is simply you're sending data values across to a software program or something that receives these values, and you can have multiple channels. So you can say, well, I want this bit of the program, this software synth, to receive on channel 5. So I could send the same controller change value across to 2 places, but unless it's on channel 5, this one's not going to hear from it. When it's all channels, it gets all the information. I have mine set up on channel 2 only because I actually have a couple of MIDI controllers that I use, and sometimes I'm using them both at the same time. So I want to be able to differentiate the one receives it on one channel if I need to. But for most people, just leave it on bass and you'll be fine. Skipping over here, it's got the controller change message of 51. Now, to explain that, MIDI sends MIDI data from 0 to 127, and so this is sending a controller change value of 51. So when I touch FS1, the foot switch, when I click it, it sends a value of controller change 51 to wherever it's going to. The other really important thing here is the controller change toggle message. So there's different messages that you can send in the MIDI language. When I first did this, had it set up to controller change, and it only partly worked. Excuse me while I ask my dog to go. Sweetie, on your bed. On your bed. Sorry about that, but when the dog needs cuddles, you got to give her cuddles. Now, the message was set up to controller change, and the problem with that was that I had it set up, say, to turn on a delay in Bias FX. So when I pressed the foot switch, it would send the controller change message off, no problem, it would turn on the delay. But when I pressed it a second time, it didn't turn off the delay because I was sending the same note on, that same message saying, hey, turn on the delay. It couldn't differentiate between me wanting to turn it on and me wanting to turn it off, which is when I discovered this controller change toggle option, which makes a whole lot more sense. Think of it like a foot switch. Toggle on, press it once, press it a second time, toggle off. So for all these values, we have it set up as controller change toggle. And as I said, it's sending a message 51. If I move this knob here, it's the top left, under foot switch expression to foot switch 2, it's all the same. The difference is controller change message 52. When I go to foot switch 3, you can see it changing to 53. So I've already set these up. I don't need to be boring and do it all again. I'll flick it all the way around to the expression pedals. These are slightly different. So the expression pedal is, like a volume pedal, up and down. So the only difference with the expression pedal is you have these additional things down the bottom right there of minimum value and maximum value. Again, in MIDI language, 127 is the maximum, 0 is, or 000 is the minimum. So what this is doing is saying, okay, when it's at the minimum setting, it's a value of 0. When it's at the maximum setting, it's a value of 127. Typically, you would use that kind of thing, an expression pedal, for things like volume changes. You might use it for the level of swells on a delay or the level of a reverb. I've had a friend of mine used to use it for the gain on his distortion. So, he might have a tube screamer set up, and, as he wants to crank the amp more, he would push down on the expression pedal and it would increase the level of that. Interestingly, you don't have to have the max value at 127. You might decide, say in that example, that the maximum you want the distortion setting on would be half that. So that's what you would set it at. So when you push it all the way down, it only goes halfway. So it's really quite powerful in what can be done. That's it. Once you've done all of these, you send selected up the top here. It gets saved then to your pod. And then the next bit of action is what happens in the program that's going to be receiving the messages. Now, I've done another video on that. I didn't want to go for one long video, and the two things are quite different. I figured that if you're a POD HD500X user, you may not use Bias FX. You might just want to know how to set it up to send MIDI control messages. On the other hand, it would be really helpful to watch this next video so you can see in practice how simple it actually is to send these messages into Bias FX or any program to be able to change your sounds. So the link will be around to watch the second video. Again, if you have questions about this, I know I watched multiple videos and read many articles and still didn't quite get the hang of it. For me, it was trial and error. If you're trying to do this with your pod and you get stuck, leave a message below, leave a comment, and let me know, and I will try to get back to you, and if need be, do another video. In the meantime, would love it if you could like the video and subscribe to my channel. That'd be awesome. But again, let's watch the next video and see how I do this in Bias FX2.